tú me avisas cuando puedo introducir.
We gotta wait maybe so people start joining in. Lo vas a ver en attendees. Good afternoon, everyone. We're gonna just give a couple more minutes until we have reached the specific time. So please, thank you for joining early, and we'll give a couple more minutes before we start. As just to for maybe already experienced Zoom users, we're using the Zoom webinar application, which the microphone will not be enabled, and any questions or any comments that you need to do, you can see a Q&A window or icon that you can select, and then you can address all your questions and comments through that, since it's going to be a little more expanded audience today. I see people from Aruba that I recognize, the DR. I see St. Vincent, and that's at least by the names of persons who I probably know that I recognize, but if you can actually write through the Q&A, which countries are you representing, it would be great. Okay, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Dominica, welcome. Grenada, Thank you, Susan, for participating also. This is an initiative that we are trying to do for the first time in the Caribbean, completely free. Aruba in the house, Brian. And depending on your comments and your reply, we could probably maintain this initiative. I think we have been doing this in other areas, and for what we have received, I think the time of the day is a little bit more convenient for some of you that you have to be working from 8 to 5, and usually you can dedicate maybe 45 minutes at the end of the day just to update yourselves in knowledge. The format of this webinar it's going to be 4 days at the same time, starting today and ending up on Friday. And it's going to be a 45-minute session. And I think the most important is the end of the session, where you will be able to address direct questions to the instructor. So you can have maybe a personal feedback in some of the cases for your daily practice equipments and studies that you're performing. So please stay tuned until the end of the day. My colleagues, Alex Hernandez, who's account manager for the Caribbean, he will be the master of ceremony in this 4 days. He will later do his formal introduction for himself and then for the instructor.
Thanks, Joseph. You let me know.
Sure, I think we'll probably give a couple more minutes and then we can start with the session.
Perfect.
So, Alex, I think you can maybe open the session. We'll do the introductory poll just to get a feel of the audience, and then we can let Rafael take care, okay?
Thanks, Joseph and Rafael. And thanks all for your presence and for taking some time to join us here at this multi-sliced CT course. We know you have a lot on your plate these days with the COVID pandemic. And so we really appreciate you taking some time to join us in this webinar. Today, like Joseph mentioned, until the 17th, meaning this Friday, we will be addressing several super interesting topics concerning CT multi-slice, taught by Mr. Rafael Magalhães from Brazil. A little bit of background on Rafael. He's a clinical application specialist of GE for 11 years. He is a biomedical scientist, radiology specialist with plus 50 years of experience in radiology. So very, very vast experience. He will basically nurture us with tips and tricks of the trade. So please, like Joseph mentioned, at the end, meaning at 45 minutes into the course, we will stop. So we can have a live Q&A with Rafael Magalhães, maybe ask some curiosities, things that you want to implement in your day-to-day basis, etc. At the end of the, again, thanks all for your support. We at Global Medica acknowledge the need of constant education, and we take it very seriously, especially with our markets. All right, so thanks all.
Right, and before we start, I think it will be a little bit just to have a feeling of the audience. Which audience are we actually addressing today? I'm gonna do if you can take just a couple of maybe half a minute just to answer what's your current specialty, which are participating today. You can vote directly on your screen. Which imaging modality do you currently use at your center? Maybe single slice, multi-slice, and which vendor, because sometimes it's very some vendors change names or particular information on their how they call their specific acquisition tools. So sometimes it's important for us to understand, for the naming purposes, what are the brands or vendors that you're actually using. we're going to share this with you later just to have an idea, okay? Okay, we'll give a little bit more time for, we got 41% of the voters right now. We have a little bit more majority. We can share the results, and then we can just share this with the Rafael also. Okay. So Rafael, this is a little bit what you have today. You have 85% are radiographer technicians who actually run the machines, 15% radiologists. Thank you very much for participating. Usually radiologists that like to know where things come out can actually have a better interaction with the radiographer technicians and demand more what the machines are capable of doing it. The main audience are working with 16 slice, 64 slides, I'm sorry, with some with the 16s and one with the 128. 62% is GE users. We have some Siemens users, Philips users, and Toshiba. So that's a little bit about the audience with no more interruptions. Rafael, thank you very much for joining us, and it's all, the audience is yours.
So good evening, everyone. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Alex. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your participating in this webinar. For me, it's a great big pleasure to be here with you for these days. I'd like to thank you for the Global Medical for this invitation, okay? So I will share my screen now. Then we can start the presentation. Please tell me if you can see my screen.
I can see it, Rafael.
Excellent. So thank you again. Well, for these days, we're gonna have some sessions in CT, right? So we're gonna have in this week some CT sessions, and today I'd like to do some refresh on CT physics and CT components. So feel free to do some questions, and by the end of the presentation, we're gonna have some Q&A session, right? So let's get started with the presentation. And before it, I'd like to show you what is the goals for this webinar. So in the next 30 or 45 minutes, we will cover these topics, okay? So we're gonna talk about CT components, reminder, acquisition and imaging reconstruction basics, and we're gonna talk about something about iterative reconstruction basis, right? So the first topic, we're gonna talk about some CT components. So let's do a component reminder. In this topic session, we will describe the main components of CT hardware and describe what specifications are important to know. And we're gonna do some CT physics refresh as well. So CT acquisition, you know, that is based on the measurement of the attenuation of an X-ray beam after it has passed through a segment of body, right? So the X-ray tube, and here I mean the production and emission of X-ray, and detector, which handles signal recovery after attenuation through the body, rotate around the structure to be studied. And many attenuation profiles are obtained at different angles and then sampled and digitized in order to reconstruct the image of the scanning structure. So that's our introduction for CT physics and basics component. And I'd like to show you this presentation. In this animation shows the CT scans principle. First, you can see the detector that receives the projections. Please notice that the more projections of the more quality this information has, we will drive to a better image quality. So what we can see is the projections. And for this, we're gonna doing our raw data, right? First of all, we're gonna do our raw data. And for the second step, As a second step for this point, as a second step, these projections are repositioned and back projected. So the kernel that you know is applied, the field of view is applied. So this will generate scanned images, okay? Talking about some components, I'd like to start with the sleep ring, okay? Let's remember that it is a very important piece of hardware. Remember that in a CT Ganter, there is a stationary frame and a rotating frame. So the sleep ring is the link between those components. Remember that we have generator, collimator, tube. So the sleep ring do this link between these components. We know that the sleep ring is responsible as well for power transmission to rotate this frame. And it is responsible for communication and control of the rotating frame. In this rotating frame, you have the generators, collimators, DSA, and tube. So, and it passes data from the rotating side to the stationary side of the sleep ring. Of course, it has many other functions, but it's important to remember these most important functions of the sleep ring. Of course, we have to talk about the generator. What about generator? So remember that it is located on the rotating frame, meaning that it will rotate along with all the rest of the components, with the tube, with the detectors, and it provides the voltage and current required to accelerate the electrons in the X-ray tube and also controls the duration of the X-ray exposure. Something to remember about generator. After generator, you're gonna do a refresh about the tube. So here I would like to talk about the three main components of X-ray tube. There are cathode, which filament of tungsten wire held in a vacuum cup. It allows to concentrate the electron beam. And remember the anode, that is a metal disc which is rotating during X-ray exposure and is where the X-ray is effectively created. And the rotor. This rotor allows to the anode to rotate and dissipate the heat. And by the last, gonna talk about focal spot. Remember that this is the area of the anode where the electrons are directed and produce the X-ray beam. So has a relationship with X-ray. So the size and shape of this focal spot has a lot of influence in the image resolution. We're gonna talk more about this in the next slides. What about the X-ray emission? Let's review quickly X-ray emission here. So in X-ray emission, a low voltage current is applied to a filament, the cathode, which causes it to heat up and does the production of a cloud of electrons. A high voltage is established between the cathode and the anode and accelerate the electrons towards the anode. Remember that for the physics? So this collision between the electrons and the anode causes the production of the X-ray. And remember that this collision causes the production of X-ray where 19% is heat and 1% is electron converted in X-rays. So here is something that is important to remember, and please pay attention on this comment. So the intensity passing through the cathode filament will determine the quantity. Here I'm talking about quantity of electrons emitted, and therefore the quantity of X-rays emitted. Here we are talking about MA, okay, milliampere. But the voltage between the anode and the cathode will determine the shape of the continuous breakthrough spectrum, and in particular, the maximum energy. Here we are talking about energy of the emitted X-rays. So here we are talking about the KVP. So when we talk about quantity, we talk about MA. When we talk about energy, we talk about KVP. Let's talk about these focal spots. Very important piece as well. So in this focal spot, we're gonna talk about the anode. So focal spot, the anode focal spot has an important influence on image resolution, right? So it together with other factors will define the actual slicing thickness or Z sharpness or Z coverage sharpness, okay? So usually the CT tube has two focal spots. The small focal spot concentrates the beam in a smaller portion of anode. This provides a better spatial resolution, but since all production is focused in a small portion, there is a limitation in MA. But we have the large focal spot. So the large focal spot can work with more MA, but the spatial resolution is inferior. So remember and notice that when you need to create a protocol with a very high spatial resolution, as for inner ear or musculoskeletal, you should use a small focal spot. Even if you have a smaller portion of or some limitation of MA, we're gonna improve our spatial resolution with a smaller focal spot. And to finish this component refresh, we're gonna talk about the detector. So CT detector, remember, is a wide coverage cone beam. It's like a wide coverage cone beam detector with multiple rows of detectors along the longitudinal plane. So the detection chains are arranged diametrically opposite to the X-ray tube on the rotary support. And there are two types of detector geometries. We have the symmetric, as one we have for some 64, 128 equipment that I like to talk. It is a 40 millimeters coverage equipment. And we have some asymmetric for system with 20 millimeters of coverage. This detector is composed of a scintillator, which converts X-ray after passing through the patients into light. Then diodes convert the light into current. And a digital converter converts the current into a digital signal. So that's a little refresh how the importance of detector and how it works, and talking as well about the symmetric and asymmetric detector. For this first part, I would like to do some quiz. So Joy, please, could you please put the poll for the first question? So I'd like to have your answer for this question for this first quiz. So the high voltage between the anode and cathode will determine the shape of continuous breaking spectrum, and in particular, the maximal energy of the emitted X-rays. So in this case, what are we talking about when we talk about energy and high voltage? What are we talking about? We are talking about MA. Is that true or false? So let's see the answers.
Yeah, we're gonna give like maybe a minute so we don't delay the conference, a minute to answers, and I'll share the results right now.
Okay. Excellent. So we have 57% false, 43% true. So remembering here, when we talk about voltage and when we talk about energy, we are always talking about kVp, okay? So we are not talking about MA in this case. So the correct answer is B, it's false. Okay, nice, excellent. Thank you for your engagement and participation on this quiz. Excellent. So I'd like to go for the second topic. And this topic, we're going to talk about acquisition and image reconstruction. Okay, so we're going to talk about some parameters such as collimation, speech, kernel, and we're going to talk about image quality as well. So I would like to start with collimation. Let's remember what is collimation, how it works. So the collimation of the X-ray beam is performed via separately controlled tungsten cams, as you can see on number 5, the tungsten cams. It is located at the collimator, right? So we know that collimation, we have two kinds of collimation. We have the coverage, the Z collimation, and we have the collimation depending of the FOV, or the field of view depending of the XY collimation. So let's talking about the collimation depending on the axis. So when we have the axis X and Y collimation aperture, so we're gonna define this as a scan field of view. So repeat, collimation depending on the axis are X and Y. X and Y collimation aperture defines the scanned field of view. Okay, so the area around the isocenter that we are going to expose and that will be able to reconstruct the images. This is the collimation depending of the X and Y axis, okay? And we have the Z collimation, or the so-called coverage, okay? So the Z collimation defines the thickness of the section of the patient that will scan in one 360 rotation. Okay, so the coverage or the Z collimation together with other factors determine our speed, could determine our speed, and it can determine the maximum coverage for dynamic image like perfusion. So it means that if two systems have the same number of detector elements but different coverage width, you will probably see differences in performance between those systems. I will give you an example for the next slide. Maybe it take more clear to us. Look, this is a representation of 16 slice industrial coverage. See that even it is a 16 slices equipment, we have different coverage for them. So look for the first vendor. This is a system, this is a 16 system, which has a 16 times 1.25 detector elements. And here we can reach 20 millimeters of coverage. But if we compare with the second vendor, even this system has the same number of detectors, we have, let's see, 16 times 0.7, we're gonna have close to the 11 millimeters of coverage. So here it's more clear. The coverage has a lot of influence of performance of equipment, okay? So even if you have a 16 slices equipment, so pay attention with the coverage to have, to understand how will be the performance of this equipment. Very important to understand. And what about the pitch? This is other parameter, very important other parameter regarding image formation and acquisitions, okay? So pitch is the relationship between the speed of rotation and speed of table movement. And to discover the pitch, we have to know the pitch is actually the pitch is the table movement in 360 degrees divided by collimated width. Then we're gonna find the pitch factor. Some important information about pitch for remember is that if you have a pitch equal to 1, remember that if you have a pitch equal to 1, the next 360 degree circuit start adjacent to where the last one started with no gap, okay? But if you have a pitch less than 1, that there is no overlap among the helices, okay? Pitch less than 1 could improve image quality for brain studies, for example. And if you have a pitch higher than 1, normally it's used for thorax or abdomen. If you use this pitch 1.5 for a brain, for example, or for a rib study, you may see some image quality loss for head or for rib helical recons. It's like a windmill artifact. So this is normal when we use 1.5 pitch. Okay, so in this presentation, so you can see this image, this figure, this presentation here, that you can see that there are some space between the slices, the helices. So here probably is the acquisition with pitch higher than 1, okay?
Rafael, just a question. So the pitch is the proportion of the table speed together with the rotation, right? So it's actually a ratio, right?
Yes. Pitch is equal to table movement in 360 degree divided by the collimator spessure or thickness, okay? So there we're gonna find the pitch factor. It's clear?
Yes.
Okay. So important to understand here. Maybe you can ask me, is there any way to decrease these temporal bone artifacts without slowing down the acquisition? Well, I would say that you can try some adjustments such as thicker slice thickness, or you can try to decrease the pitch and increase the collimation maybe, but possibly you will lose some of the spatial resolution for this. Otherwise, the way to improve the artifacts caused by the pitch would be to decrease the pitch factor, okay? However, your examination will be longer, probably, okay? So another alternative is to use some technological resources that may be in your system. if you have these some technological resources in your system that could be helpful to reduce the windmill artifact, probably for thin slices acquisition. Okay, so there are some industry technological resources that could help to reduce these windmill artifacts for pitch higher than 1. Okay, it's like we have, for example, a IQ enhance. I'll give an example in the next slide. So look, here we have for the left side, in the original image, some artifacts on the school. Okay, so for the right image, we have the windmill reduced image. So here there is no change in the CT parameters. Here we was just use the IQ enhance. There is a technological resource which reduces these windmill artifacts for brain studies. That's an example that I would like to give you. And after we talk about pitch, I would like to do another quiz. So we're gonna have 2 questions here. The first will be about the Z collimation, and the second will be about pitch factor as well. Okay. So let's go to the first question. So what can we say about a Z collimation? Then we have the answers, and if we have a 0.5 pitch factor for a brain acquisition, we expect, so please answer.
Okay, we're gonna give just a couple more seconds until. All right. Okay, I'm gonna stop the poll and I want to share the results then.
So first question, what can you say about Z collimation? The correct answer is B. Okay, defines the thickness of the section that we scan in 360 rotation. That's correct. And let's see the second question. I can see the answer. Okay. If we have a 0.5 pitch factor for a brain acquisition, we expect. So the correct answer is D. Okay. So you got it. Congratulations. Excellent. So let's continue to talk about, can't move my presentation here. Sorry. Okay, let's continue to talk about image formation. Here I'd like to talk about slice thickness. Let's try to understand better this about slice thickness, okay? So here we have a schematic representation of the difference on slice thickness selection between single and multi-slice system, okay? I know that we don't have we don't have anybody here using single slice equipment, but just for reference. So, okay, so on a single slice, the coverage defines slice thickness, okay? When you talk about multi-slice, the coverage is defined by detector configuration, okay? So if you have a symmetric detector architecture, it's pretty easy to understand. The minimum slice thickness will be defined by the detector cell size, okay? But if you have on a asymmetric, this is depend of the collimation used. If you want to, we want to have a collimation of 20 millimeters for some acquisition on an asymmetric detector, we have to select a rebuilding thickness of 1.25. Okay. But if we want a collimation of 10 millimeters and we have an asymmetric detector, we should choose a rebuilding thickness of 0.625. So the collimation on a multi-slice is defined by a detector configuration. So depending on your system, you're gonna have different collimations and different collimation coverages and slice thickness for the study, for the protocols that you want to apply. And jumping to reconstruction interval. Understanding reconstruction interval. Many questions about this at the customers. So the reconstruction interval actually is the distance between the centers of two consecutive images, okay? Sometimes you're gonna have some partial volume averaging as an effect, okay? So partial volume averaging is an effect consisting on a wrong representation of I2 or Hensfield unit of some structure caused by the fact that is a density is average within the slices, okay? Well, but best solution to lower partial volume is decreasing thickness, especially for axial images. So we could lower the interval, then we can reduce the partial volume effect. So as well as we could increase the spatial resolution overall 3D and MPR imaging. So we could perceive the spatial resolution overall for 3D, and the impact of these beneficials decrease as we decrease native thickness. So just for remember something about reconstruction interval. It's a little slow here to me to move the presentation. Okay. After talk about reconstruction interval, it's important to talk about recon algorithm. Okay. So the attenuation profiles collected by the detectors are converted into a frequency before the back projection stage. So the frequency spectra also undergo a filtering function. The selection of high frequencies by hard filters favor the representation of the anatomical limits of the structures, but it increases noise, so low density resolution is decreased. So remember, if you need images with good spatial resolution, of course, you have to see, depending on your system, which kind of canons you have. So this is a representation of GE canons, but depending on your system, we're gonna have to select the specific canon for spatial resolution. So canons is specific to see good lung images, bone images, or borders, okay? So in general, for example, we have the lung, the bone, and the edge kernels. In Siemens, you could use for lung, for a thorax, for example, you could use a B70 for a lung, or for a bone, you could use a B60 or B70. If you want a high resolution study for lung, you could use a B90. So depending on the vendor, you have different numbers, okay? But important to know that if you want to have a very good spatial resolution, find what is the kernel for spatial resolution at your system, okay? But conversely, the elimination of the high frequencies by soft filters attenuates the noise and the visibility of the contours. So in this case, we talk about density deviation, okay? So in this case, we're gonna have a low density deviation. So if you want to have some kernel for density resolution, try to find soft kernels, okay? Like standard, like soft, like B30, B20, okay? It's very important to understand these kernels' impact on image quality and image impression that you're gonna have. Jumping for pixel. Okay, let's understand and remember about something about pixel. So remember that the reconstruction matrix is a matrix of 512 times 512 and does not change size, okay, normally, right? So it's important to understand that the pixel does not change size. It's the area, it represents that changes, okay? So a smaller field of view increases the spatial resolution, so remember that. And how could we determine a pixel? So the pixel is determined by a calculation that we're gonna have field of view divided by matrix. Then we can find the pixel, okay? Just to remember this. And we cannot talk about pixel and forget to talk about isotropy, okay? So the objective sought in the reconstruction of the images to obtain a voxel as close as possible to the isotropy in order to obtain a reconstruction of identical resolution in the three planes, okay? I mean, we have to have the identical resolution for the axes X, Y, and Z, okay? That's the isotropy. We could define isotropy as a unit identical in the three planes of space. So how can we find it? Okay, so the X and Y axis depend on the size of the matrix in the field of view. And let's see some representation in the next slide. That probably it will be more clear for you. So let's remember, so the pixel size is reconstruction FOV divided by number of rows or columns in matrix, okay? So if I have a field of view of 320 with a matrix with a 512 times 512 pixels. If we divide it, we're gonna find the 0.625 by 0.625. Okay, so here we found the x and y axis. So what is the slice thickness to have an isotropic image? In this case, we have to select a slice thickness as 0.625. So we're gonna have a voxel with X, Y, and Z with the same number. That's the isotropy. So we're gonna have a reconstruction identical in the three planes. Okay, so remember this. This is very important to remember and understand. So, with this talk about isotropy, we finish the image reconstruction and acquisition, and we're gonna to the last topic. Okay, we're gonna do the iterative reconstruction basis. So it's a little more fast, just a remembering. So let's start the iterative reconstruction basics. But we have to start talking about iterative reconstruction. We must remember the generation of reconstruction. So first generation is the filter back projection. Okay, so that's the classic model that we have on CT. The second generation, we have the introduction of image filters and canyons. And the third, we have the corrections by recurrent space, okay, and electronic photons and noise models. So here we can see those reduction preserve the image details. So it started to be applied on the daily routine. So remembering filter back projection. So CT scanner work by acquiring a large number of projections, as we could see on the first slide of this presentation. So the scanner acquired a large number of projections of the patient per rotation by rotating X-ray and an X-ray detector around it. So it takes enough projections from various angles, and you have a raw data set that can be reconstructed into an image. Okay, so this is reversing by mathematically the projections process to create an image to the patient. So this is the classic filter back projection. Okay, so our challenge today is to minimize those while we acquire images with sufficient diagnostic quality. So the iterative reconstruction refers to an image reconstruction algorithm used in CT that begins with an image assumption and compares to real-time measurement values while make constant adjustments. So I like to call these loops, okay? So the more possibilities for correction loops, the more noisy correction can be made and the more accurate the image quality. Okay, so with the iterative reconstruction, we can reduce noise in diagnostic imaging while preserving the structural details in the image for low dose studies. So in this case, we save those without loss of image quality. So here is a representation of the best non-iterative recon filter on the market. So notice that due to generation of the loops to correct image noise, it's normal to have a reduced recon speed when you compare to the filter back projection, okay? And here observation. So remember, before using iterative reconstruction, the site physicist, in collaboration with the radiologist, should conduct image quality evaluations with varying degrees of iterative reconstruction and different scans techniques, both at routine dose and with decreased dose. So always validate the image quality with your physicists and physicians, okay? Let's do some review. So here we can see a study of abdomen with dose reduction and not without image quality loss. So look that the standard deviation is very low when compared to the image without iterative reconstruction. So it was a reduction of 50%. So, and we have a standard deviation to 29.6 compared with the without IR 43. So a lot of noise reduction with a lot of dose reduction. Okay, remember that the standard deviation shows you how noisy is your image. And here another comparison that's for abdomen study. So notice that it's possible to verify that we have a low dose with a 399 mA image and is less noisy when compared with a 656 mA image, okay? So we have a 40% of dose reduction and we have a very good image quality, okay? So that's what we can expect about iterative reconstruction. Basically, we're gonna have a low dose with a very good image quality, okay? So that was my last slide. So I would like to finish with this last quiz. So what is iterative reconstruction? So please answer. Excellent. Excellent. So the correct answer is A, the reconstruction technique designed to reduce noise in diagnostic image while preserving the structural details in the image. So we've seen, we remember the CT physics with CT and features components. We could see something about image reconstruction and understanding iterative recon usage and advantages. So thank you so much for your time here. Here is my contact. Please reach out on me if you need something. And now I think it's time to have a Q&A session, right?
Yes, correct. Thank you, Rafael. Obviously, just to remember you guys, this is our first module from the remaining 3 more days. This is something that we need to cover, which is we're going to use in the next 3 days when we talk about protocols and vascular protocols and all that I think that you guys are expecting, but we need to cover the pitch, slice thickness coverage, the interval, the reconstruction algorithm, and dose, which is something very important in the last years that has been very concerned the industry. So we have a couple of questions. If you feel free to ask more, there's a question regarding whether the pitch has any relationship with the thickness or the slice thickness. So that's a question that's on the air right now.
Okay, so the pitch has a relation with not the slice thickness, but the coverage, okay? So remember, let me try to get back here. Let me try to get back here. So the pitch is the relationship between the speed of rotation and the speed of table movement. So remember, when to find the pitch factor, we have to divide this movement by the collimator width. So not especially with the slice thickness, okay? So the relation with the pitch is with the coverage, the collimator, the Z coverage. Okay.
All right. There's another question regarding, can we apply the same matrix? I guess it was referring about the pixel in CT as well as MRI.
The matrix for CT is a fixed matrix. In MRI, you can move this matrix. So in CT, we have 512 times 512. So I wouldn't say that we could use the same matrix for CT or MRI.
Perfect. There's also another question. What type of study would a pitch greater than 1 be good for?
Okay, so it depends on your system, okay? In general, it's the good or the good scenario should be to have a pitch until 1 for every acquisition, but depending on your system, you have to put pitch over the 1. So in general, for equipment, for 16 slices, we could use a higher pitch for abdomen and thorax, and pediatrics as well, depending on the anatomical region, we could use pitch higher than 1.
Rafael, maybe using higher pitches when we had single slice scanning, or?
Yes. If you have a single slice scanning, probably you have to use more pitch over than 1 because you need time, okay? You need acquisition time, good acquisition time. So,
but with like higher coverage, like a 16 or 64 slice scanner, you should be always trying to work from 1 or under, correct?
Yeah, I would recommend it if always when it is possible.
Perfect. There's another question here. Should we acquire vascular studies with a thin slice, with a slice as possible to avoid reconstructing artifacts, or how do we get around that?
Should we acquire vascular study with
a thin slice as possible to avoid the reconstruction, or maybe I would say loss of
We're gonna have a session for vascular study, and we're gonna talk about it. But the importance of thin slices for vascular studies is to have a good spatial resolution and image quality and more information of acquired anatomy, okay? So it depends on kind of vascular study we are talking about. If we are talking about brain, we're gonna have more artifact with the thin slices. In this case, I would not recommend to thicker the thickness of slices, because for vascular study, we always need your thin slices.
Yeah.
So we could improve these artifacts, changing some CT parameters or recon algorithms like kernel, things like that, but not change the slice thickness.
Right. Yeah, I think for those 16 slice users that we know there are in the audience, there you could be using sometimes, and probably some of your equipments could be equipments with asymmetric matrices that you have maybe 8 submillimetrics, 0.625 slice thickness, and maybe you have to use 1.25 millimeter slice, and you have to play with that. I've seen, and I don't know, correct me, Rafael, if I'm wrong, with the new releases of 64 slice scanners, most of the industry is trying to move away from the 1.25 slices, and most of the 64 slice scanners today are 64 slices, 0.625 or submillimetric slice, which has a very good relationship between coverage and very thin slide thickness, and it's the best of both worlds. You have coverage, and then you have submillimetric slices for higher resolution.
Perfect, this is correct. So when we have a 64 equipment, we have a symmetric detectors row. So in this case, we're gonna have all of these slices as a thinner slices. So we always move for this kind of equipment, we move the protocol to use the thinner as possible, okay? And that's for the symmetrical, but when we talk about 16, sometimes we have to have time, we have to do a fast acquisition, and sometimes we have to move for different collimations.
Right. Well, I guess we don't have any more questions. I think there's someone, would detector type affect what?
Joseph, you froze for a second.
What type of collimation that, or I don't know if.
Maybe you can repeat, Joseph, because you froze.
Right, would detector type affect what type of collimation that can be done and how?
I would say that the detector type, not a specific detector type, but the detector position could affect the collimation, okay? And could affect other parameters like pitch, because depending on the detector position, maybe you can have some mismatching of reading. So we could have some problems with the X and Y aperture. So I would say that not change the collimation, the type, not the type, but the possession of the detector could have some influence on the collimation and the performance of equipment.
Okay, there's another question. What's the difference in algorithm or reconstruction algorithm between bone, bone plus, and detail?
Bone, where's the question? Bone, bone plus. So, don't know what system you use. So remember when we were talking about the kernels. So those are used for high resolution images. So imagine that the bone algorithm give you a level of detail, then Bone Plus give you a more level of detail of the borders and detail more level. So it's like a chair, right? So you have the bone, after you have more detail with Bone Plus, then we have more detail with detail. There are more questions. I can't see here, pause stop it.
No. I think that was the last question. Thank you very much for your participation. We will then connect tomorrow at the same time as today. and we will be covering on our second day. It will be then directly into CT protocols optimization, which I think is what you're expecting, and how do you can improve your acquisitions and specific tricks for making a better image quality studies on multi-slice CT.
Perfect. So tomorrow,
thank you. Yes.
sorry, Joey. So tomorrow you're gonna have some presentation, a fast presentation, but I'd like to have more Q&A session. So to answer your question regarding protocol improvement, okay?
Thank you. Thank you very much, guys. Have a great evening, and see you tomorrow at the same time. Take care. Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rafael.
everyone.
Thank you, Joseph.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Good evening.
Thank you all. Good evening.